Hello, friends in Boston. I'm Janine Beichman. I'm so glad to be here today and so grateful to Keith Vincent for making it possible for me to participate from such a long distance by video. However, I have to confess that I've never given a presentation by video before, so I am the tiniest bit nervous. In any case, let's go. The spiritual life of an octopus, a woman back from flower viewing and undressing in the privacy of her bedroom, the pale, almost unearthly cries of wild ducks at twilight. What could they possibly have in common? Not much, one would think, but strangely enough, there is room for them all in the haiku, the shortest form of poetry in the world. Here they are. Octopus pots, brief dreams beneath the summer moon. I slip off my flowery kimono, uncurl rainbows of laces. The sea grows dark. The wild duck's cries, faintly white. Common, everyday things, all of them, but with an ethereal, almost surreal quality. The first poem is by Masaoka Bashō, the greatest haiku poet of all, as I'm sure everyone here knows. Octopus pots were ceramic pots that take advantage of the propensity of octopuses for hiding in nooks and crannies. The fishermen lower the pots to the bottom of the sea during the day and then pull them up shortly before dawn. In the darkness of the pot as it rests on the floor of the sea, the octopus settles in for the night, innocently dreaming, or so the poet imagines. At dawn, when it is hauled up, its brief dream, for summer nights are short, will be over. Our life, its life, is no more than a dream. But it has been touched by the moon, symbol of enlightenment and eternity. I will come back to this poem again, but for now let's move on to the second one, which is by Sugita Hisajo, one of the major haiku poets of the 20th century and a woman. I slip off my flowery kimono, uncurl rainbows of laces. Back from flower viewing, the woman undoes her kimono, which is patterned with flowers for the season. As everyone here, again, probably knows, kimono have no zippers or buttons, but are held in place by fabric cords. Beneath the kimono itself is the underkimono, and beneath that, a simple shift. So the woman in a formal kimono is all wrapped up in cords and strings and laces of cotton and silk in a variety of colors and shapes, like a package. As she slowly unwraps herself, the cords and ties open, trail, fall, making a rainbow of colors. When this poem was first published in 1919, almost 100 years ago, it was interpreted as a simple celebration of uniquely female experience, although there was some muttering about its so-called narcissism. The sensuality is more unabashedly celebrated today, but the cords and laces are also read as symbols of the social restraints that bound women so tightly when the poem was written. To my 21st century ears, a phrase from a poem by the poet called Sapphire describes Hisajo's poem perfectly. Pain pulled through the eye of beauty, Sapphire wrote. That's exactly what this poem is. The third poem is by Bashō again. Night is coming over the sea, and the cries of the wild ducks calling back and forth somehow seem to take on body and color, pale against the darkness, mingling with the last leftover light. The synesthesia, or the mingling of senses in this poem, appears in a number of Bashō's other poems as well. Parenthetically, let me add that the idea to use 6 lines in the translation is mine, does not come from Bashō's original poem. And of course, all the translations used here today are my own, except where noted in 2 cases. Haiku has other tones than the slightly surreal, symbolic one of these 3 poems. One that we are familiar with that we may even think of as quintessentially haiku-like, is the down-to-earth tone of the next three poems. Here we have Matsuo Bashō again, then Yosa Buson, then Kobayashi Isa. Autumn's nearly gone. How does my neighbor make his living? Oh, the pleasure of crossing a summer stream, sandals in hand. Snow thawed. Suddenly the village fills with children. And then there are poems like the next two, also seemingly very simple. But rather than being about happy topics like beauty or pleasure, they are about pain and death. Kobayashi Isa, on the death of his infant daughter. The world of dew is a world of dew, and yet. Masaoka Shiki on his deathbed. How much life is left to me, brief these summer nights. Unlike the previous poems, these autobiographical poems by Isa and Shiki are so personal that knowing who wrote them and a little about the circumstances adds a great deal to the poem. But sometimes we don't need to add the poet's name because he does it himself, as here, where Isa, who always identified with the downtrodden and oppressed, introduces himself to a small frog. Skinny little frog, don't give in. Here's Isa. So now that I've touched on the four greats of haiku, Bashō, Buson, Isa, and Shiki, let's move on to the form itself and its origins. What we now call haiku was not originally the independent form that it is today. It originally appeared either within works of prose like Bashō's famous travel diary, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, or as the first link in the chain of linked verses called haikai renga, or informal linked verse. Many of the verses that are now famous as haiku were originally the first link in a linked verse chain. Yosa Buson's mustard seed flowers, moon in the east, sun in the west, is one example. Here it is in its original context, followed by the second verse, composed by Buson's disciple and friend, Chōda. Mustard seed flowers, moon in the east, sun in the west. Far off at the mountain's foot, herons fade into the mist. Buson's poem is a description of an early spring evening. At that season, sunset and moonrise coincide, and almost coincide, and the bright yellow of the mustard seed flowers lights up the fields. Buson describes the scene as though he were standing somewhere outside the field, watching the moon rise in the east, and opposite it, the sunset in the west. Chōda, his eyes led by a flock of herons, or perhaps one heron, extends the line of sight towards a mountain in the distance. One modern reader, the poet and critic Ooka Makoto, commented, "Read together, it is as if one's eyes were sweeping over a pastoral landscape of the late 18th century in panoramic fashion." It was Matsuo Bashō and his followers who had brought informal linked verse to a peak of artistic perfection in the 17th century, before Buson. And by the late Edo period, linked verse had become extremely popular. This led, paradoxically, to a watering down of standards and a general debasement of the art, which, combined with the vogue for all things Western in the early Meiji period, threatened for a time to kill off not only linked verse, but also that first verse, the hokku, which had achieved semi-independence by then. It was this dismal fate from which the passion, determination, and brilliance of Masaoka Shiki, whose birthday we are celebrating today, saved it. So why was Shiki so passionate about haiku? What was it about haiku, and what was it about him that brought them together for their fateful encounter? Shiki chronicled the beginning of his own love affair with haiku with disarming simplicity and humor in his sickbed diary, A Drop of Ink. Looking back on his college days, when he moved out of the dormitory to a house where he lived alone, he describes how his obsession with haiku led to his flunking out of school. His desk was usually cluttered with haiku books and novels, but when an exam loomed, he would neaten it up and set out his notes. But then, as he writes, when I sat down quietly and saw it so bare and neat, I felt a nameless pleasure. As soon as I felt so pleasant and cheerful, a haiku would flash into my mind. When I opened my notebook, a 17-syllable verse would emerge before I could read a page. I couldn't write it down since I had put my poetry notebook and even my stationery away. So I would write it on the lampshade. Verse after verse came forth. Entranced, I abandoned the examination to cover the lampshade with writing. I was in such a state that as soon as I tried to stop writing haiku and prepare for an examination, verses would flash through my mind in droves. Examinations came to me nothing but a flood of poetry. Bewitched by the goddess of haiku, nothing could save me. I failed the final examinations of 1892 and withdrew from school once and for all. Partly then, it was the ease of writing haiku that made it attractive. But it was also the fact that for some reason, haiku was a particularly congenial way for Shiki to express his sheer pleasure at being alive. As Shiki got more into the form, he began making some rules for himself and then teaching them to other people. The most important one was dedicated observation of one's surroundings. He made this into a strict discipline, the most fundamental exercise in the poet's training. In 1899, in his instructions to the beginning poets under his care, he wrote this: "You must not stop when you have managed to extract one or two poems from some broad view. Next, you must look down at your feet and write about what you see there, the grass, the flowers in bloom. If you write about each, you will have 10 or 20 poems without moving from where you are. Take your materials from what is around you. If you see a dandelion, write about that. If there is mist, write about the mist. The materials for poems are all about you in abundance." In these vivid and encouraging instructions, Shiki emphasizes looking at nature in quite a matter-of-fact way. In a different essay, however, he showed that you can observe nature by listening as well as looking, simply by closing your eyes and listening intently. In the backstory for Bashō's famous poem about the frog, Old Pond, a frog hops in, the waters sound, he imagined Bashō alone in his cottage at a creative impasse. Bored and dissatisfied with the poetic styles current at the time, he is brooding over how to create his own distinctive poems, or, as we would put it, he's trying to think about how he can find his voice as a poet. Lost in his thoughts, writes Shiki, Bashō felt as though a dense fog had fallen and simply sat there in a trance, neither asleep nor awake. At the moment when all nature was quiet and all his daydreams had faded out, he heard the sound of a frog jumping into the old pond outside his window. He himself did not murmur them, nor did anyone speak, but the lines, "A frog hops in, the water sound," reached his ears. As though awakening from a dream, he inclined his head for a moment and then raised it, and a broad smile broke out upon his face. In other words, he knew where he was going from there. To sum up, at the basis of the famous frog haiku and Shiki's view was observation of an unusually intense sort, really concentrating on what is around you, really being there in the moment, not simply looking or listening, but being wholly present. This is what we now call mindfulness, and for Shiki, it was the cornerstone of haiku composition. Shiki's signature method, the sketch from life, or chassé, rests upon this kind of intense observation. When practiced devotedly, it led to something more than reflecting reality. It drew the practitioner into a kind of quiet creative ecstasy, which Shiki recorded himself. As Shiki put it in Haiku Wastebasket, the writer takes his raw materials from nature, then refines them, and makes them part of his own imagination. In this sense, one may call him a second creator. In his diary, A 6-Foot Sickbed, Shiki recorded a moment when he actually came to feel that he knew what it was like to be the creator of the world. The medium is visual, not verbal, but the idea is the same. I had a flowering branch placed beside my pillow. As I faithfully sketch it, I feel I am gradually coming to understand the secrets of creation. One of the joys of sketching from life lies in pondering how to obtain a slightly darker red or a rather more yellowish one. When the gods first dyed the flowers, did they too lose themselves in musings like this? So haiku brought Shiki happiness more than any other activity did, because in it he used first mindful observation, and second his imagination, and at times he achieved moments of ecstasy. Mindfulness and imagination were linked, not separate. How does this apply to other poets, specifically to Shiki's views of Yosao Buson, who was rediscovered by Shiki? Shiki pointed to two things especially in Buson. One was Buson's gift for precise observation, and the other was his use of imagination. In such poems as these, Buson observed small, precise details of natural flora and fauna. The peony's petals scatter, pile up, 2, then 3. Struck by a raindrop, snail closes up. Some sandals walked on flowers I see. That morning lazybones. As for poems of imagination, these were two examples. Harvest moon, a rabbit crossing Suwa Lake. Give me lodging, he cries, flinging down his sword. What a blizzard. In Harvest Moon, one needs to think about the light of a full moon and how it would make the lake look, the white wavelets that would be there, and which could look like a white rabbit hopping across the lake. A white rabbit who, of course, is the rabbit in the moon, come down to earth. Give me lodging is like a line in a story. A samurai comes rushing in from a frigid, snowy night, begging for lodging, throwing down his sword to show he has no intention to harm anyone. As for Bashō, Shiki revered Bashō for qualities opposite to those for which he admired Buson. The most important was Bashō's mastery of the tone of sublimity and grandeur, to use Shiki's words, the macroscopic scale of some of his poems, as in this famous poem, Stormy Seas, Stretching Over to Sado, the Milky Way. Shiki thought this was a realistic description of looking out from the coast of Niigata to the island of Sado, sad home of so many medieval exiles. But many years after Shiki died, the diary of Bashō's travel companion Sora was discovered, and there it was found that Sora had recorded that on the night of the poem it was actually raining, and Sado was invisible because of the clouds. So Shiki was wrong in thinking that this was a poem of natural observation, yet it still fulfills his own dictum that observation and imagination should go hand in hand. How did this interplay of mindfulness and imagination play out in Shiki's own poetry? For an idea, let's look at Shiki's famous poem on the coxcombs in his garden. Coxcomb flowers, must be 14, maybe 15. Coxcomb flowers are bright red, rather tall, and their petals are very thick. Shiki titled the poem Looking Out at the Garden. On first reading, it seems no more than a casual comment to himself or to someone sitting nearby as he lies on his sickbed, looking outside. But if one visualizes the mortally ill person that he was speaking the poem in a quiet voice to someone very nearby and intimate, it suddenly expands. Now the flowers with their magnificent, powerful red and strong, thick forms impress him with their vitality, but at the same time they are his own opposite, emphasizing his own decay. In haiku, we may say the reader, having imagined this, possesses the power of life and death over the poem. I have always thought that this was one of the few possible interpretations possible. But recently, thanks to Keith Vincent, who introduced it in his Shiki series, I learned that Oka Makoto had proposed a completely different interpretation. Shiki, argues Oka, is remembering a time from the year before, when a typhoon destroyed the flowers. Before the storm, there had been 14 or 15 of them, and he misses them now. But only Kyoshi, of all the people at the poem party, on that day, the day Shiki wrote the poem, had also been there when the typhoon struck. So the poem was a sort of quiet memory shared with Kyoshi, a remark that expressed his feeling of friendship and love. Based on this interpretation, Keith offers a totally different translation. Big red coxcomb stalks, 14 or 15 of them. Do you remember? The question is, do we have to choose one or the other of the two interpretations? I would say no. I want to plot it like a fan, with the poem itself as the pivot, and different interpretations radiating from there like spokes on the fan. And of course, each interpretation has in turn at least one possible translation. The coxcomb poem is an extreme example of how much the interpretation of a haiku can vary, depending on what the reader brings to it. In terms of mindfulness and imagination, you could say that Shiki has supplied the mindfulness, the intense observation of the flower, but the reader supplies most of the imagination, aided by the head note and, in Oka and Keith's interpretation translation, by Shiki's prose essays about the coxcombs. That's about it for imagination and observation or mindfulness, and I want to move on now to the second pair that I spoke of in my abstract, to lightness and stickiness. First, lightness, by which I mean a certain casualness or lightheartedness, a kind of brightness. Lightness is inherent in haikai-linked verse. The first session on record took place in 1206 as a way for some poets to relax and kick up their heels by composing informal linked verse after a strenuous court waka session. Even after haiku became its own independent form, it kept that lightness. But at the same time, it acquired something I call stickiness. By this, I mean something about the poem that hangs on and doesn't let you go, so that you keep coming back to it in your mind. Other people might call this profundity, but I use stickiness to emphasize the feel of it, how it sticks to your mind, even your body. It's not an intellectual thing, but a whole body thing, as the poem inscribes itself in your mind and body, maybe even burrows into your life. In his poem, Japan, Billy Collins, former poet laureate of the United States, riffs on a haiku by Bashō in a way that evokes this strange combination of lightness and stickiness. Here is the haiku by Bashō. Perched on a temple bell asleep, a butterfly. And here is the translation that there is convincing evidence Collins used. The convincing evidence that Collins knew the poem in. On the 1-ton temple bell, a moon moth folded into sleep sits still. This, of course, is by X.J. Kennedy, not by me. In either translation, as in the original, we have a tiny insect on a large bell. This is a light subject. There is something sweet and charming about this innocent creature resting on the huge bell, which could begin to ring at any minute. At the same time, there is a sense of suspense. When will the bell ring and upset the delicate balance of this moment? Will the butterfly leave before then or not? So what seems a casual observation actually catches a fragile moment of stillness between two actions. Collins describes himself walking through the house, saying the haikus, quote, few words over and over, like eating the same small, perfect grape again and again. But the haiku's images keep expanding in his mind as he recites it. By the time you get to the last stanzas of his longish poem, there is nothing small or perfect about the original haiku. The bell is the world, the moth is life. That moment of balance between two actions has been magnified 1,000,000 times. These are the last stanzas of his poem. When I say it at the window, the bell is the world, and I am the moth resting there. When I say it at the mirror, I am the heavy bell, and the moth is life with its papery wings. And later, when I say it to you in the dark, you are the bell, and I am the tongue of the bell, ringing you. And the moth has flown from its line and moves like a hinge in the air above our bed. I think Collins explains stickiness about as well as anyone could. Now we come to generosity, and why I want to call the haiku a generous form. Let me explain. The multiple readings that Collins describes of Busson's poem are not confusing, they are enriching. Like a plume of Suzuki grass swaying in the wind, he does not waver, but simply moves to and fro, choosing now one, now another. Haiku allows this freedom, in fact encourages it, largely because of its minimalism. I stress the minimalism part here because I don't want to be too wonky, but haiku's close relationship to classical literature is another reason for its polyvocalism. Haiku's suggestiveness and elusiveness, its permissiveness, if we may call it that, have an effect on readers and writers of haiku. The plenitude of possible interpretations, none of which cancel each other out, makes one feel, for a time anyway, that, dare I say it, the universe itself is generous. Even if Shiki did not practice the kind of close readings that we do, I think he felt this quality in haiku. In line with my emphasis on multi-interpretations, I want to leave you with one more reading of the octopus poem, the first poem I talked about. Here it is again. Octopus pot, brief dreams beneath the summer moon. When I was a child living on the shores of a small harbor in Connecticut, lobstermen used to set their traps in the waters off our house, and in return for letting them use our driveway to park their truck, they would give us the lobsters that were missing claws, which they could not sell. Many years later, when I first read Bashō's poem about the octopuses, I imagined the octopus pot, which I had never seen, as a lobster pot. And every time I read the poem, I thought of the place where I had grown up. The poem's lightness is in the unstated comparison of human beings to the octopus, which is slightly ridiculous. But its stickiness is there too, that comparison that you can't get out of your mind, that never goes away. Somehow your mind going back and forth, to and fro, between the octopus drifting in its underwater pot, the moon that shines down for the brief night on the dreams within the pot, and shines down too on our own lives, which are also dreams. How are we any different from the octopus? We aren't. In Bashō's poem, we meet the octopus, and it is us. Bashō's haiku on the octopus can survive my double exposure reading, in fact thrives on it, becomes, for me at least, a bigger poem, a more memorable one, just because the octopus in my imagination mingle with the actual lobsters I saw and sometimes ate as a child. My early reading, or misreading, if that's what it was, is folded into my later reading of the poem. Effortlessly, the poem expands to include me and my childhood home, to include Bashō, to include that octopus in the inland sea hundreds of years ago, not to mention the moon, enlightenment, eternity. That too, all these things together, is what I mean, and all these things able to exist together is what I mean by the generosity. Having come this far in my thoughts, I suddenly remembered a line from Walt Whitman in his magisterial poem, Song of Myself, which seemed to express what the goddess of haiku could say if she could speak. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. I began with 3 very different subjects, all of whom fit, surprisingly enough, into the same haiku world. I end here with 2 unlikely creatures, Walt Whitman and the goddess of haiku, walking side by side. Who would have thought that good old Walt, with his long lines and Promethean poems, could have anything in common with the minimalist haiku? But he does. He does. And if we listen well to both Walt and the goddess, I think we may even hear, to quote J. Silveria, the power of our diversity. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and I hope that these rather scattered remarks will become fodder for some of the discussions that will go on later in the symposium.